All right, everyone. I think I'm going to go ahead and call us to order. It's a little after 8. My name is Joshua Eisenman. I'm an assistant professor at the LBJ School, specializing in Chinese politics, and a distinguished fellow at the Strauss Center, our host here today. It is my distinguished honor to introduce to you my friend, my colleague, and my boss, Angela Evans. Angela Evans, the dean of the LBJ School. I have to say, her support for China studies has been amazing, right? Whether it be in terms of students, faculty, research, from the very beginning, she's been all about increasing our exposure on China policy-related work. And I have to say, I really appreciate all that support. That is in part why we're here today. So I don't want to go on for too long. I'll take the floor and give us more nitty-gritty about what we're doing today after your remarks. But I want to pass the microphone. Welcome. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming and taking time. What I know are very busy schedules, whether they're scholarship schedules or teaching schedules or travel schedules or whatever you're doing to do this. I think it's really important that in this day that we have very good information, we have really good scholarship, we have very good research that's done on China and U.S. relationships in particular, but on China just to understand China. I had some prepared remarks, but I think I'm just going to put them down. You know, for us in the United States, and those of us who are not steeped as China experts, we have sort of a schizophrenic relationship with China. You know, we love China one minute, we think it's just got so many things going for it, and the other minute we're worried about it, we're afraid of it, you know. We say, well, we do diplomacy, they do kind of things that are not quite that, you know, in the diplomatic arena, quite that kosher, but I'm not sure where the real truth is. So what we're trying to do here and under Josh's leadership at the university and is try to dig down so that policymakers, and this is my concern, is policymakers have the best information, they understand what the research says, what it doesn't say, can listen to people like you who've been experts in the field for years. I have an old colleague. I have a veteran colleague here, Bob Sutter. He and I served at the Congressional Research Center. I know, we can't do age discrimination in this. And we were bred in an organization that says, if you're going to talk to members of Congress, or you're going to talk to heads of state, or you're going to talk to big policymakers, first, you need to know, one, what the data says, what it doesn't say. Two, what are consistent, persistent problems and tensions in those kinds of environments? So we understand those, because we're not going to solve problems like that. So what are these consistent tensions, and what are the big questions? And then how do we go out and talk to the people that we think we're representing? Whether it's the diplomatic corps or the people in the U.S. who are affected, you know, the businesses, the trade, students, or we're in China. And China's not like one China. China is a very diverse, multiple set of backgrounds, cultures, etc. So this is very, very complex. So for me, having this, the complexity of this issue on top of the students who are studying at the LBJ School in the global policies program, as well as the domestic policy, because I think they do blend. It's extremely important that they see a complex problem and how people get into that problem in a way that's just, we're getting right in the middle of it. We're not going to be afraid of it, we're just going to get right in the middle of it. So I think we have our work cut out for us. I think at the university, we have great leadership in Josh Eisenman. We've started a China Public Policy Center. It's in its nascent stages at the LBJ School, but it's serving the entire university. So the president of the university is very much devoted to ensuring that we have a great set of scholarship and ways that we can connect with China and our Chinese colleagues. So I'm very pleased. I'm sorry I can't stay with you all day because the panels look really interesting, and all of you with this, you know, this expertise in one room is really wonderful. So I hope from this we do get some publications or some other things coming out of this, so the rest of us who couldn't be here and hear this would benefit from those kinds of products and thinking. So thank you again very much. You came at a nice time in Austin, so sometimes, you know, we're back in August and people go, oh my gosh, they won't remember these days, like, you know, in January and February. So I hope it's a really wonderful conference, and I know Josh has put a lot of time and effort, and our partners at the Courthouse School as well, so it's going to be really good. So congratulations. I'm very pleased to be here in Washington. Thank you.
I'm pleased to mention that we have a special issue of the Journal of Contemporary China, and the papers are going to be in there, so I'll get you, as soon as that's published, I'll be sure to get it to you, and so we'll get the scholarship and research out around.
Well, this is exactly what we should be doing. We should be convening. It's not like, one's a leader or another. We should be collaborating and convening around bringing the best information that's balanced. It has really good facts that we can, that is in a language that policymakers can understand. I'll put the little plug in there. So that we can really make a difference in their thinking about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks so much for helping us with that. Thanks, everyone.
Well, now that the fun is over, it's time to work, right? So I had a couple of things I wanted to say here, and I wrote them down because otherwise I'll totally forget them and remember them later today. Okay, so welcome to UT, got that done. Okay, so first let me do a bit of a plug for the Strauss Center, right? The Strauss Center has been enhancing our work on China studies, and we've got a lot more to come. So while there are people here and it's the beginning of the day, I just want to say that we've got a variety of collaborations, including one with Stimson Center, the Carnegie Council in New York, a variety of different publications and sponsored research that we're working on. All of that is kind of in its nascent stages, but everybody in this room, especially the people who are working on this particular project, I'm going to try to keep you guys involved and in the loop. Eric Heginbotham and I just had a book come out this week called China Steps Out, and Strauss Center supported in part that research through an RA who helped put together all the data sets and all of the work in the back of the book. So Strauss Center has been kind of supporting my research and is an important part of China Studies research, and in fact I would argue at the university right now the leader in China Studies research at this point, bar none. That plug aside, I want to kind of give you guys a sense really quickly of why I decided to pull this together. There's a bit of, I don't want to say emotion behind it, but as many of you know, my advisor was Richard Baum at UCLA. And as I was nearing graduation, Professor Baum got very ill and then he passed away. And Professor Baum's office was, I don't know if anybody ever been in his office. Brantley, maybe you've been in there? No. But what he had just massive quantities of items in there. I mean, just stacks of people's dailies from the 60s. I mean, it was an amazing place to go into, those old manila file cabinets, and you could open it up and gold was in there, right? And I always wondered what was there. And after he passed away, I was told to, take a look, see what you want to see. And so it was very intimidating. I walked into the office, and 90% of me expected him to be sitting in that chair where he always was, right? But he wasn't there, of course. And I began to go through these files, and all the while I kept thinking he must be watching me getting angry because I'm going through his files. And then I came across this folder, and it was of a conference that had been held, and he had been a part of, and my other mentor, Harry Harding, and others had been a part of it in the 70s. And it was this list of kind of people who later became luminaries, but at that point were in the kind of beginnings of their career. And I was thinking, how amazing it would have been to be at a conference like that, and to put together a conference like that. And so I began to think, well, if I had the chance, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to pull together a group of people who are doing amazing work and try to allow them to do that work and put it together and produce a great product. And the issue of domestic influences in Chinese-US relations came to mind because we've spent so much time looking at things often through an IR lens, billiard balls on the table. And it has led us, I think, to neglect the domestic side of things. And for those political scientists in the room, nested games is a part of what we do. We talk about domestic and international causes. And it seems that in the China portfolio, the international causes had seemed to kind of become quite prominent. But yet we've seen very recently, both at home and in China, changes and evolutions which have brought our attention to the importance of domestic politics. In China, the rise of Xi Jinping, and in the US, the rise of Trumpism, however you want to look at it. But undoubtedly, as the papers show, there's been a great influence of domestic politics and an increasing influence, arguably. So I would say that in many ways, what we need to do is kind of right the balance. Not that we have to move away from IR theory and just throw these things out, and Eric wouldn't allow it. But what we need to do is, I think, right the balance a little bit. And I think that's in part what we're trying to do here. And I'm very grateful to have Sam as a partner supporting this effort. I should also mention that one of the people who helped to kind of conceive of this effort is Professor Fan Shiming at Beida. He can't be here today because his daughter is very ill, so he has to be there. But he is somebody who is also, believes very strongly in what we're doing here. And Bob, I think, was there at kind of one of the culminating discussions of this, where he was presenting some of the research that later, I believe, is in his paper here today. So it's unfortunate he can't be here, but what I'm, I guess, trying to intonate is that there is, I think, an increasing consensus on both sides that the domestic influences are an important part and they ought to be looked at. So, what are we doing here today? Well, unlike most conferences that I'm a part of in Washington, which are for the audience, right? People make presentations, often one after another. The audience then asks questions, and it's a Q&A session. What we're doing here today is specifically focused on the papers themselves, trying to improve the papers. The goal is to produce, for those of you who are not, who don't know, is to produce a special issue of the Journal of Contemporary China, of which Sam is the editor. And I will be the guest editor of this particular special issue. Not this particular one, but the one that we produced. And so today our style is going to be a little bit different. What we're going to do is go one paper by one paper. We're going to have a person present their paper, give the rough outlines in about 10 minutes long. The goal here is to summarize the paper briefly, but also to intonate to the audience and the other members areas that you think are weaknesses, things that you might ask for people's advice on. And then we're going to move to the lion's share of the portion, which will be about 30 minutes, where we're going to have people making suggestions, making comments. Of course, you can ask questions of the person, but to the extent that that person is silent and writing, they're probably gaining more from the experience than if they're answering questions. So, and we're going to go one paper by one paper by one paper. At the end of the day, we have a a panel of two people, actually not at the end, maybe the third panel, and William Norris has not yet arrived, so we may juggle at the end. But that's okay, and the morning will be as it is. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else on my list that I never can read. Yeah, I think that's it. Unless there are any questions, I think we can call up the first panel. Yes, sir?
What is the name of that publication?
It's called the Journal of Contemporary China. Actually, I can go ahead and pass it to you. There's an excellent book review in there. All right, so if there aren't any questions, I think maybe we can go ahead and call up the first panel and get started. That, really on time.
I should go third. Which one? Since I'm really in the next panel. Oh, I see. So maybe
you look sure you can start with Sam. I like it.
Nice to meet you.
All right, welcome everyone. So my name is Xiaobo. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Government here. So today we have three distinguished scholars who's going to talk about the domestic influence on U.S.-China's policy. And as Josh has mentioned earlier, this is a panel where we would like to help the authors as much as possible. So I'm going to run it like that in the sense that I'm going to keep the presentations like in 10 minutes straight, and then that will give you like 30 minutes Q&A so that you can get more feedback from the audience. And without further delay, I'm just going to go into the order of the presentations, the list on the agenda here. So our first presenter is Professor Sam Zhao from University of Denver. So will you like to give a 10-minute presentation of yours?
Okay, thank you. And first of all, I want to also take this opportunity to thank Joshua Eastman for putting this conference together and put us on a program as a co-sponsor, but we have done nothing. And Joshua has done everything and to make this conference a great success. I'm very confident that we'll produce some really first-rate papers to be published on the subject. In fact, especially domestic sources of foreign policy has been he is very strongly in that. I'm also very strongly in this subject. The topic of my paper is to look at how American reflection of the engagement policy since Nixon and how that has become a variable of a factor in the Trump foreign policy toward China. Here, what I'm looking at is the policy guide the U.S. Since the 1970s has been called into questions in the last decade, in fact, since China is rising. This policy has premised on two assumptions. One is that the U.S. will help China modernize. China will have middle-class civil society emerging, and would eventually become a democratic society and shares same values with the U.S. The second premise is that if U.S. helps China integrate into the U.S.-led international order, China would eventually become a responsible stakeholder and not challenge, but part of the U.S.-led international system. In fact, that premise was stated very well by Nixon's article in 1967 on the Vietnam policy. I really like that quote because he said for long term we cannot leave China, which accounts for 1/4 of mankind, outside of the family of nations forever, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hate, and threaten its neighbors. So in other words, is that the world cannot be well if we cannot change China. So U.S. basically to bring China into the part of the international society is going to change China along the direction that U.S. Wants to see China to be. And for that purpose, U.S. has worked very hard to open China, help China technologically development, investments, know-how, and everything. And even the U.S. Sand Fleet was on the Pacific, helped China to a certain extent for its trade. And China also, out of Cultural Revolution, was willing at that time to work with the United States to become modernized, to be part of international society. So there was a grand bargain or grand consensus on both sides to work together for quite a while. Even the Tiananmen Square, quite a while, both sides really overcome so many problems to engage with each other. So the U.S. side engagement policy guided the relationship with China for last 45 years, almost half a century. However, these premises for many people in the U.S. has been called into question after China become rich, become part of international society, become modernized, especially since 2000. I think the turning point was 2008, 2009. global financial crisis, China did much better than the Western countries. So China became much more confident in their own capacity, in their own way of modernization. Even China proposed the China model, which they think their modernization is not based upon the Western values, Western way of liberal politics, and even the market part of has been changed because China's state-centric part of modernization, and also China has become much more assertive in the relationships with the U.S., with the other developed countries, in particular with its neighbors. And so in that context, that reminds me again from a lot of people, Nixon's statement in 1968, China is still there to nurture its fantasies, to cherish its hatreds. Everybody owes China, and also threatening its neighbors. So in this case, the so-called engagement is just like an experiment of scientific research. Now, we don't have evidence for many people in the US to prove its success. And in fact, many people have very clearly argued, I documented all these research, all these statements, that the engagement has failed. In fact, there is to me, and looks a very strong consensus, a new consensus is emerging that US has to do something different instead of continuing this engagement. So some writings even say we have entered a post-engagement time in the relationship with China. In this so-called post-engagement time, the call is that getting tough to China, getting tougher to China. Even some people argue that the US should adopt a new policy. And the alternative here is a Cold War style containment against China, because US was successful to contain the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now we have a new threat, a new competitor, a new revisionist power. I mean, name it, all those terms we used for the Soviet Union have come to be applied to China. So the US has to get tough. This tough policy should be on all fronts, economic, military, and even political, to have a regime change in China. And I even, what's his name in the Naval War College, that Yu Maocun, that article, I really find that article very interesting. The US should have a NATO style alliance, multilateral alliance, try to contain China. And he argued very strongly that the condition has come because we have enough democracies in Asia Pacific, which could put the US in a position to have multilateral democratic alliance against China, and also we have a common enemy, China. During before we entered post-engagement period, we did not have those conditions. So that's why US had a bilateral type of alliances. Now we should have a multilateral. And all those writings about Mathieu-Dittis, how to pronounce that name?
Mattis?
Yeah, Mathieu-Dittis.
Joe Mattis.
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sparta and Thucydides. Yes. I can never pronounce that name, that term right. Thucydides type of the trap, and inevitability of a war between China and the US. All those type of writings have become so popular in last several years, and the call. The writings, the talking of in the U.S. side of a post-engagement time, the failure of engagement have become a very important background to push the U.S. policy toward China toward the direction of a tough and tougher side. Then we look at the U.S. policy toward China in the last two administrations. In my paper, I found this is a very important background for the U.S. policy toward China, but I really have not found the U.S. policy has become really toward in containment, not even containment, really tough position. Not talk about Obama administration, even the Trump administration in the last 1 year has not really got to the direction as these people called for. Looking at Trump policy, I found two very interesting phenomenon. One is really continued the previous administration's so-called cycle patterns. Every U.S. president come to office either tough at the beginning or soft at the beginning to become tough later on, or tough at the beginning, then soften later on, then come back to tough to soft. The kind of cycles. Trump has come in within 1 year, have an M-shaped cycle. He talked so tough during the campaign trail. Then he softened when he came to during campaign trail, and also as a president elect, he talked tough. Then he came to office, softened so extremely toward China, built such strong personal bond with the president of China, became his whole cabinet tried to work with China. Did not do anything he talked during the campaign trail in the first 100 days or even first half year. Then he started to send kind of naval ships, have the freedom navigation, talked about some trade issues and some other issues, human rights, human trafficking, and start having arms sale. And then during his November China trip, he blamed his predecessors instead of China for all the imbalance of trade or everything. Then he came back, he became tough again. So you see the kind of M shape within the first year. And then what you find with Trump is that he talks so much, tweets so much, but really have not done much yet. So he talked tough, for sure. But the policy front only lasts, even the national security strategy is also, for me, most talking part. How to implement that strategy, even national defense strategy, all these things, I have not got clue yet. So we see this background, but U.S. foreign policy toward China have not been affected dramatically. Why? Because then this is my last part of my paper. Because there's no better alternative than engagement. Containment is not a viable option for the U.S. In the policy toward China. Engagement failed. Long live engagement. That's what I see it, because several points I want to make here. First of all is that many people criticize the engagement to brought all the problems. I don't think that's the fair judgment of engagement, which I think at least from 1970s up to today has performed that function. In fact, the engagement is not to bring Chinese people more like Americans. That's not supposed to be the purpose. Just to bring, just to serve the interests of both the U.S. and China during a particular period, in a particular circumstances, which I think serve those purposes. China has changed dramatically, although not the way the U.S. would not try to see 100% to the U.S. Image, but Chinese people benefit so much from this relationship, and China has played some from U.S. perspective, not positive role, but played also some positive roles, and the U.S. also benefits from the whole process. Looking back, 1970s, 1980s, U.S. had Soviet Union threat, had all those problems That was why U.S. engaged China. Now U.S.-China has developed relationship of mutual interdependence, and this interdependence cannot interrupt. If U.S. turn to contain China, would hurt not only China interests but also U.S. interests. So that's first point. Second, when we talk about those getting tough to China, how could U.S. getting tough to China at this time? Because U.S. influence, U.S. power, U.S. everything in Asia Pacific has been diminished. Even the Trump policy to get out of TPP, to abandon Obama's pivot toward Asia Pacific, all those policies make all those Asian countries are more willing to work with China than the U.S. U.S. image in the Asia Pacific, the Trump to do the right thing, those kind of polls have indicated U.S. become less popular, less liable for many countries in those areas. So in that context, for U.S. getting tough to China in the Asia Pacific becomes even more difficult. Although all the countries try to be not want to choose side between China and U.S., but the U.S. way of contain China in Asia Pacific is no longer there. Third, to contain China, to getting tough on China, U.S. has to put its own house in order. I don't see that has happened with Trump in the White House and so many problems in China. In fact, in my paper, I also argue that people think of the failure of engagement not only because China's assertive behavior, not only because China has been performed really badly internationally, also on the value front, also because of U.S. failure in foreign policy. U.S. unilateralism, U.S. itself damages its own values in the world. U.S. gives up global leadership. All those problems in the U.S. also made it U.S. difficult to contain China. Finally, fourth point is that if U.S. treat China still the case as enemy, you get enemy for sure. Here, China now is in a position to modernize its military, its economy, everything. If U.S. going to contain China, that will give the voice of those conservatives, nationalists in China a strong reason to confront the U.S. Still in China, we have those two forces, liberals and conservatives. Although conservative now has an upper hand, but if the U.S. going to that direction, you'll give those people even much more hands. So in conclusion, I will see U.S. has not found a better alternative. What U.S. should do at this time is try to just work with China as what it is, to have a hedge strategy. I mean, containment, engagement is part of hedge. A hedge is not only to help China, but also to have to be prepared if China does not behave well to the U.S. U.S. has the power, U.S. has capacity to confront, to balance China's power. So U.S. has to emphasize this part of engagement instead of only the other side. So that's my argument here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, so for those of you who haven't read Professor Zhao's paper, you should definitely take a look at it and get a very actually nice overview about this historical background about engagement, how it progressed over time, and now to get into the Trump regime, that how things haven't been shifted. So it's much more rich material than the 10-15 minutes that Professor have highlighted. So the way I want to run the discussion a little bit different. I would like to collect like 2-3 comments, questions, and then Professor Zhao can give a very brief response, or maybe not, because I think this is an opportunity for you to get feedbacks. I think better time for getting feedbacks. So, any questions? Let me go to audience first and then come back to you. Yeah, please.
Well, very impressed, enjoyed the reading. I was thinking, how could you write so much? So my strongest reaction when I read this is I always thought engagement it's not about harmony, right? So there will be different aspects of the policies and the rhetorics and representing different interests in the United States. So engagement, even in the engagement dominating time period, so you talk about 2005, Bob Zerik's responsible stakeholder, but I also know that the period was full contention of China's energy security, acquisition in Africa, Sudan. Hedging was actually the parallel advocacy from Washington. And so the 2 points that I feel, whether you can kind of define engagement more using settled rhetorics and also policy demonstrations or illustrations of different policies, and versus engagement versus containment. I feel these are kind of very opposite groups, but within each of these packets, there should be many layers of cooperation and conflicts.
Great, thank you. I see a hand over there. Yes, please.
I very much enjoyed the paper, and I read the unrevised version, so I'm sure that whatever comments I have are corrected already in the revised version. I just, the narrative, which is very persuasive, as I thought about it, it's a narrative of sort of the American phenomenology of the relationship. It's a narrative of what we were trying to do and how we saw China's reaction. And it seems to me that perhaps for the purpose of this conference, where domestic factors are being emphasized, there's two things that could be added. One would be a greater sense of the Chinese domestic reaction. After all, Deng Xiaoping wasn't blooming like a flower under the sun of Richard Nixon or Jimmy Carter. He was, as Josh's paper will be pointing out later on in a very different context, domestic factors are very, very important to the opening up of China, the failure of state-owned enterprise and overinvestment under Heginbotham was very important to the deregulation of external contacts. That whole development of Hong Kong rather than US directly was important. So a sense of how things look to us is not necessarily capturing all the factors that are accounting for Chinese development. The second thing is how we see ourselves looking at things is also not exactly complete. After all, one of Richard Nixon's major reasons for opening to China was to cut off North Vietnam's supplies, to isolate North Vietnam so that he could have peace with honor in Vietnam. In general, is it so much that China is so different, or is it that China is more powerful now that causes the anxieties in the United States? If China had exactly the same politics over the last 30 years that it has had, but had a 3% growth rate, would we be as worried about China? Or would we be more complacent about waiting for China to evolve into a modern country? What is the role of power in this sense of anxiety and also in the critical view of China? And I think I see Eric shaking his head, and I think he's going to be addressing some of this in his paper. But the only thing that Strachow's narrative is a great narrative of the sort of what has become a mainstream American view of the relationship. But the mainstream American view is not everything. You know, there's a wider context, and a good deal of that context is domestic facets of domestic politics and realities on both sides.
Thank you. Maybe I take one more. Jessica in the back.
Thanks so much. I really also enjoyed the paper. I have a slightly different direction paper, because I also really enjoyed sort of the synthesis that you provided of the current state of the debate in Washington. My sense is that you want to push back against that, and in your presentation just now, I heard a lot more of why they are wrong, why the sort of engagement is dead, why that's wrong. In fact, you say law of engagement, but what I was waiting for in the paper was a full-threaded defense of what we should look for, why this current strategy, or why we should not abandon engagement. And in particular, I think that you could be a little more pointed as to why the critics of engagement are wrong, perhaps decoupling this desire for domestic change from the sort of mutual benefits that engagement has provided, as well as providing sort of new markers for this is how we know that the policy, U.S. policy is succeeding, because there's a lot of people who are going to say it's failed for X, Y, and Z. They're very focused in how they do that. And another way you could do that, I think, would be to say, what was the alternative to engagement? If everyone's saying, oh, this was, policy of engagement was based on an illusion, well, let's rewind the clock. What would the alternative been? So rather than beating up on this past few decades or so, let's be more objective in our assessment. So these are just some suggestions. Again, I really enjoyed the paper and want it to be even sort of better as a sort of nice counterpoint to where the conversation in Washington is going.
All right. So, Sam, do you want to take more questions?
Yeah,
or you want to respond?
I will not answer them because I think it's a help me
You
to.
want more questions? Okay, great.
Yeah.
And Josh?
Sam, this is really great. I really enjoyed it. Actually, it was quite a riveting read, and you don't find that much in academic work, right? Yeah. You're like, I need a coffee, but not this one, right? I was burning through it. So, and I really appreciate your writing style and the way you put it together. The use of analyzing the policy documents, the statements, even things in the national interest and other venues and outlets. I really appreciated that. So I just basically have a couple of questions I'm going to put out there and things I hope you could address at some point. And then I have a suggestion in terms of this discussion of engagement I want to put out there. I also want to say one thing before I do that. Last week I happened to be in Washington and meet with some of the people in the administration, and I would say this dovetails exactly with what they were saying. That they basically are in search of a new strategy, right? They know this didn't work, but they don't know what else. So I think I think that's actually pretty accurate as to what we're seeing. So one question would be, are there Chinese in the leadership that regret China's more assertive approach after 2008, 2009? That they think that was a mistake because it brought about all the things you talk about, right? So maybe one thing you could talk about is any Chinese voices who now are saying, well, maybe we didn't need to X, Y, and Z, right? And then there's little discussion here about issues of soft power and soft influence. One issue, and this could be debated among scholars, is if you're engaging with China, and the Communist Party of China has been, United Front tactics have been amazingly successful over their history. We can go into the chapter and verse. But if you're engaging with the party and you don't have a clear objective, then anytime you have engagement, it's viewed through United Front approaches, and United Front approaches are not static, they're evolutionary. So you're trying to engage with an enemy in order to bring them about a change in their mentality toward you, so that they see you better at the end of the day, rather than at the beginning of the day. You're cultivating your friends, cultivating the middle, cutting out the hardliners, right? This is the kind of Maoist theory, right? So one thing you might get into is the Chinese side and intentionality between, we know why the U.S. wanted to engage China, to, bring about liberal reform. That was why we wanted. But why did they want to engage us? Is my assumption that it's through United Front Maoist thinking correct, or is there another reason? Is it simply a much less, more, one could say, benign reason? I could see many arguments, but to the extent that you can help explain the Chinese inclination to engagement, the Tao Gang Hui theory, how does that fit into this idea? Because my understanding is Tao Gang Hui assumes eventually that you do confront the hegemon at some point, right? You don't Tao Gang Hui by your time and have your capabilities forever. You do so temporarily, and then when the moment comes, right? So this would suggest, and this is the ultimate question for you, that there was a nefarious strategy of the ilk that Michael Pillsbury talks about. And I'm not sure I buy that, but I think you need to confront the question of whether or not there was intention on the Chinese side to deceive, Or were there well-meaning liberal people who really thought this was going to work on the Chinese side? So was this a scam? Were we duped and fooled, and we should be wise to it now, as people like Pillsbury suggest? Or was this, it just didn't break our way? It could have broken our way. These were well-meaning people, but it just didn't, they were liberals, but they didn't win the battle, right? And I think getting into a discussion of that background in China, I think could be helpful. In terms of engagement, and this is more of a policy suggestion we could think about, engagement doesn't have to mean 1,000 flowers blooming. It can mean 5 really strong, beautiful flowers, right? So we could have a smart engagement, a more selective engagement, not get rid of engagement, not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but select a variety of engagements that we feel are in the interest of the US people, in the interest of, well, however the Chinese Communist Party would see it, but from the American perspective, in the interest of the US taxpayer to pay for, and not just have an engagement for an engagement's sake. Not be meeting about Tibetan rights, and in fact, that's not really the discussion being had, right? So the question, I think, can also be about the you talk about gradation between engagement and confrontation. There can also be gradation within engagement. You can engage 100%, all engagement equals good, or you could be more selective and say only one engagement, or you can go anywhere between the spectrum of infinity engagement to 1. There can be, right? And so the question is, how do you determine a good engagement from a bad engagement? Anyway, this is not something you necessarily have to get into, but in terms of thinking about this issue more generally, I don't think we have to be binary about it. You don't have to be on the side of engagement or conflict. You can be in between and say certain things we engage on and other things we're more forthright about. Anyway, I really enjoyed the paper, and thank you.
All right. For the interest of time, I would like the commentator to have a sort of questions, and so that we can see all the feedback. Wow. It's all right. So we have many actually questions here. The lady on the back, please.
I think the section on the reflection on the engagement policy is really top-notch and very convincing. So I have comments only on the getting tougher on China section. You cited the tough talk on China by President-elect Trump during the campaign as an example of China of the U.S. sending out signals that U.S. should be tougher on China. But people are going to ask, isn't it normal for candidates to talk tough on China? So if this paper can show that this campaign was particularly tougher on China than previous campaigns, I think the argument would be stronger. And then the security section of the getting tougher on China section, you cited several scholars in D.C., Dan Blumenthal, Grim Ellison in Boston, and Rand and U.S. Navy Naval Academy. All of these are the traditionally known hawkish people. So I think if the paper is able to show some of the moderately minded academics or policy people like Michael Swain or Jack Bader saying the same thing and
Mike Lambden also said the same thing.
Yeah, that makes the argument even more convincing.
Great, thank you. And you here.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to Josh's point about kind of the gradations of engagement. I was reading the paper, and the one thing that really stood out to me is I felt you were dancing around the word congagement that emerged a few years ago to talk about areas where we could, like last night, Admiral Inman was talking about areas to build fences and areas to engage. And so for me, kind of one issue that I think needs to be addressed in the revisions is what makes your understanding of engagement different from this buzzword congagement that came out I think probably 3 or 4 years ago now. The second point I wanted to address, adding a bit more color to how China is understood as a competitor. I think there's also scales of near peer competitor to strategic competitor. And I think there's a transition, at least with the Obama administration to the Trump administration, that we now see a strategic competitor, where there's clear areas of conflict and tension, whereas the Obama administration was much more, we can help one another become better in key areas, and it's this near-peer dynamic with the potential for destabilizing circumstances always existing. And then finally, my last point, this is really small, but on page 8 and 9, you talk a bit about strategic culture, and I think it's really subjective and hard to differentiate kind of how we think China thinks about strategy versus how we, the United States and Americans, think about strategy. I think there's a very clear ways, means, ends nexus and how China is trying to shape its policy towards the US, and we're trying to do the same thing. And so to cast it in these sort of Confucian, 孙子兵法 sort of terms, I personally find to be a bit too subjective to draw conclusions from.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, back.
I thought that the paper, like everybody else, I enjoyed it greatly, but it seemed like there was a little bit less on the domestic sources in the U.S. in terms of their U.S. voices, but they're mostly kind of between hawkish and maybe formally dovish voices on China as opposed to societal interests. There's a little bit on labor unions, but there could be a little bit more on the sort of private sector interests and how they're seeing the evolution of the relationship, maybe private sector sense of not having made as much, had as much market access, whether or not that's shaping private sector interests differently than before. And then the other thing that you touch on a little bit is how the relationship between the U.S. and Russia was fundamentally different because there wasn't great economic interdependence, whereas there is in the case of the U.S. and China. But the interdependence goes well beyond economic interdependence. That there are sort of shared global issues like climate change, which only has one sort of, there's one passing reference to it, but there are a whole host of other issues like that where you could say that, a hedging strategy that deals with their interests in sort of regional hegemony are red lines for the U.S., but there are other issues of common interest that we have to continue to work on because we don't have a choice.
All right, any other questions? Yes.
Yes, so I think this is reiterating some of the previous point about domestic problems of Chinese economy and like how U.S. policy was seeing that. So I think a lot of voice talking about like China is projecting power mainly because China is being more confident and assertive, but there's also another voice, like especially in domestic China, like talking about China is projecting power mainly because it's trying to find an international solution to domestic problem, like trying to export some of the excessive capacity of Chinese production, such as the Belt and Road Initiative. So, in other words, China is probably doing well after the financial crisis, but it's probably just not as bad as what some Western countries do. And so China is still having some like fundamental economic problems, especially after financial crisis. And so I was wondering like how maybe you can talk a little bit in your revised version of paper, like talking about how U.S. policy will think about that part, like when China is projecting power, to what extent it's actually reveal some of its fundamental vulnerable economic problems.
Great, thank you. And the gentleman over there.
Secretary Tillerson is going to be here this afternoon at 1 o'clock. Two questions. Number one, why isn't he here today listening to this before his talk? And the second is, we have wonderful scholars here throughout the day, and you do all this research and study and everything. Where does our State Department get the information to come up with their policy? Are you scholars engaging them, or where do they come up with this?
Thank you. And then I think our panelists also have some questions. Let's start with
Go ahead, Eric.
Okay, sure. And just a couple of points. First of all, boy, you had a terrific title there. Engagement's dead, long live engagement. I would be honored to be included in a volume with a paper titled that. So, that's the first point. The second point is I'm kind of a veteran of the old Japan wars of the 1980s, and I wanted to come back to Brantley's point about whether we'd have this discussion or whether the discussion would look the same if it weren't for Chinese power. So, the interesting point for us, since we're focused on the domestic dimensions and domestic drivers here, isn't, to weigh IR versus domestic explanations, but to look at the relationship between the two. So, in the 80s, when Japan's GDP was 2/3 that of the United States, and we thought that their GDP would overtake ours, we had the Labard book on the coming war with Japan. We had lots of criticism of Japanese trade policy. My dad was shuttling back and forth, slamming the Japanese all the time. And we had criticism of Japanese domestic policy, this one-party system, and this, that, and the other thing. So, I think it's fairly clear that the the balance of power and the sense of rivalry obviously shapes how we talk about countries. There's a lot you can draw on from the, the domestic peace theory literature about how, in fact, democracies or countries that might have once thought of each other as democracies have in fact fought wars, but then they redefine the other as non-democratic after the fact. So in any case, I think you probably want to play with this relationship between China's rising power and our discussion of China. And then last point, and I think several people have really hit it, but I would second their views that containment, I just question whether that's a bit of a straw man. I mean, there is a discussion of containment of sorts, but it's obviously a non-starter, and I think that discussion of getting tougher with China is much broader than that. And I think you've got a discussion in here of the rebalance within the hedge between the two parts of the hedge. But in any case, I think probably it would be a little more compelling if you widen the aperture on your critique to a somewhat more representative range of that part of the discussion.
Good. Thank you. Bob, you have the last word.
Thank you. This is an excellent paper, and my only suggestion would be, I think there's not enough emphasis on the economics driving the reevaluation of China in the United States politically. The campaign rhetoric in 2016 was heavily economic. The security issue didn't come up very much at all. The South China Sea was hardly mentioned by any candidates. It really was just, very secondary. And what's happened in the United States, if you're looking at domestic drivers, we've had a bit of a revolution on how we look at economics. And so the leading candidates in the 2016 campaign were advantaged because they had this perspective on how you looked at international economics. And we look at it very differently than we did in the past. And the conventional view of free trade and so forth just was attacked, and the people that wanted the TPP, they backed away. Mr. Cruz backed away, and Hillary Clinton backed away, because this thing was politically not saleable. And so it's not just Chinese power, I don't think. It's how the American economy has been disadvantaged in this. It's this broader complaint about globalization, which I think needs to be factored in. I think in the election campaign, it was more important than strategic issues, for sure. And then subsequently, I'm not sure where it comes down in the Trump policy. The national security policy does have a clear linkage of the security dimension and the economic dimension, and so but Trump's economic policies are still not clear, but that's a different story. But the main point is that you make several categorical states. You say on page 11, the central element of getting tougher to confront China's ambition is to seek dominance and to push the U.S. out of the Asia Pacific, the world's most dynamic region. I don't think that's true. I think it's much more economic. I really I think it's vague, but it's not that. It's because that just doesn't, it gets attention from people like you and me and Eric and others, but it doesn't get that much attention in the broader public scope.
Great. Thank you so much. And can I ask you to wait for the?
Yeah, I will not do it, because that will help me to improve.
Great. So we're going to fantastic. We're going to move on to the next paper, and if we have time by the end of this session, I'm going to allow the panelists to just give some quick feedback to the overall questions. So our next paper is Professor Bob Sutter from George Washington University. So I will, you have a 10 minutes presentation, and then we can open the floor for discussion.
Well, thanks very much. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I'm a little under the weather. Sorry for my voice. I very much thank the sponsors for allowing me to be part of this very distinguished group and this innovative type of way of looking at things. It's a very exciting project. I'm really happy to be part of it. This is what I'm doing. My title is Congress and the Trump Administration China Policy: Overlapping Priorities, Uneasy Adjustments, and Uncertain Outlook. So I'm looking at Congress, and Congress is, and I have 4 basic points that I'm going to make in the paper, that I'm making in the paper. First, something about Congress and its traditional role in dealing with issues in U.S.-China relations since normalization, and then look at the context of the Trump administration policies in the election of 2016, get a sense of that, and then look at what I see as adjustments. And what the players here are Mr. Trump and his administration and congressional leaders, particularly in the Republican Party, the House and the Senate leaders in particular, and how both sides have had to adjust a lot. And because of the campaign was very unconventional in a lot of ways in dealing with the situation. So, and what I see is a lot of convergence. I see that they're coming together. It's in a lot of ways to have a coherent approach in dealing with China, but there's still a lot of uncertainties, and so the last part is looking at those uncertainties. So let's a couple of key points I can make. First one is about the normalization of relations with China. This came about, we all need to remember, this came about for security reasons. This didn't come about for economic reasons. This was very much a security thing in the beginning. And what the two governments did is that the two administrations agreed on the Soviet Union and Vietnam and things like that, but otherwise they didn't agree on anything. And the countries didn't agree on anything. We had these enormous polities and societies that totally different with one another on a whole range of issues. And they were forced together, compelled to do this. And the administration kept pushing this, and so Congress went along with this. They understood to some degree, but they represented all those different components in American society that disagreed with aspects of China. What China wanted, what it was, and Congress lives on this. That's how it works. It accommodates these constituencies and reflects them. And so Congress has always been a brake on forward movement in U.S.-China relations. That's usually its role. The president has great power in foreign policy. He can move ahead. He does for a whole range of important reasons, including this view of engagement that emerged later, which is what we've been talking about. But did the Congress buy it? It's a very mixed picture because the country didn't buy it fully. It was all these differences were reflected at various times. And at some times, the Congress was a driver. And after Tiananmen, the Congress was a driver. They were in charge, and they basically helped tear up the understanding that the United States had with China, the framework that we had in dealing with one another over time. So that reality is something that, so when you look at Congress and what its attitudes are toward China, my sense is it's still in that sort of wary mode, and it reflects all these competing interests that are in the United States, reflecting differences with China on economic issues, political issues, social issues, a whole bunch of things. And so that's, I just wanted to mention that as we look at the role of Congress in the recent period. In the election campaign, you found that in the 2016 election, the congressional Republicans had a pretty clear view of what they wanted about China policy. President Obama had a rebalance policy. They generally liked it. They thought this was a good idea. The framework was fine. They just felt he was a wimp, that's all. He wasn't resolute enough in pursuing it. And so they wanted peace through strength. They wanted to, and this framework was fine. Free trade, the senior leaders at least, Ryan, McConnell, people like that, they're free traders. And so they like this type of thing. And they, of course, wanted a more robust American military presence in the region. And they favored democracy and human rights in various ways. And lots of people in Congress favored that, and they did too. And so that was the context. And this is where the domestic factors, and when Shui-Shang does his paper, I think he needs to consider this too. Then you get surprises that really upset the situation. And the election was a big surprise. I did some interviews before the election really reached its high point in the summer with various staffers and so forth. And they were, they thought they were just blindsided by the trade issue. Sanders and Trump and their whole approach to economic matters was blindsided them. And so the upshot here is that this this makes it difficult for coming together. How do we come together? In the campaign, for example, the question was raised, was China a big issue in the campaign? It was a big issue in the campaign. It probably would have been a lot bigger issue, except that we had a candidate like Donald Trump. And we were spending all our time arguing about trade issues and trade in general. And then he had these other issues that he raised. Make the allies pay for their support, for the U.S. support. Make them pay. And if they don't pay, withdraw. So withdraw from Japan, withdraw from South Korea. And if they develop nuclear weapons, that's okay, because it's going to happen anyway. Those are his words. And then he said, and at one time he said, I really think I need to meet with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. This is very important to do this. So these kinds of things sidetrack the conventional debate about China, the idea that China, we need to be tougher on China, and all these issues are very important. That was still there, but it was overshadowed by what do we do about Trump and what he's saying, and what do we do about these economic issues, which we hadn't expected. So he comes into office, and the Republican Party is very strong on China, and their platform in 2016 is very strong on China, very critical in this regard, lays it out very clearly. And Mr. Trump follows, and so I go through what he's done. And the zigzags that Suisheng shows are obviously there. I mean, he's going back and forth. But he does have a North Korean strategy. And the North Korean strategy is something that Congress wants. They've wanted this for a long time. A much tougher approach to North Korea and tougher on China, dealing with North Korea. So he's doing that. Then Trump switched his policy on allies. He just switched. And so now he favors allies. Well, that's very much in line with what the Republican leadership wants in the House and the Senate. And he switched on non-proliferation. Nuclear proliferation is a big, big issue for him, and now that's why he's putting a lot more pressure on North Korea. So these things are all converging. You know, they're coming together. And then Donald Trump shows that he's good at symmetry. His people in Asia, he's very effective in doing this. Look at the record. He goes to Asia. Every one of these government leaders wants to be nice to him. So we need to ask ourselves why, but they're all doing it. And so whether public opinion doesn't like it, the governments they're trying to stay on his good side for a whole range of, we can think about what the reasons are. And he engages in multilateralism. He does all the ASEAN things that he's supposed to do, except that he doesn't want multilateral economic agreements. He doesn't like them. He thinks they're bad agreements. And so Congress supports this, and he downplays human rights and democracy, and has the Thai leader come, and the Malaysian leader come, and he invites Duterte from the Philippines to come, and you don't get a lot of blowback from Congress on that. So as far as his diplomacy is concerned, the Congress is in line with what he's doing, more or less. On the security side, as far as allies are concerned, and toughness toward North Korea, those are all positive developments. It leads to a convergence. Let's see. On the economic policy, though, Mr. Trump is ambiguous still. He has these competing camps in his administration. And so where he's going to come down on this is really not very clear. And so, because they're still there, you know, we still have moderates and we still have protectionist people, and they're very prominent in very prominent positions, and they seem to go back and forth. It's an area of unclarity. Where the Congress is on this, I mean, people like Ryan and McConnell and others, they're free traders, but of course there's a lot of complaining about China's economic practices, and so maybe they'd favor this type of thing. If Trump moves toward a targeted type of protectionism, where he says these Chinese are doing bad things to us in this area, we're going to punish them, and keeps an open trade policy, in the end, if that's where he winds up, that would be probably acceptable to the Congress. So the story in the paper is that Mr. Trump has made a variety of adjustments to the mainstream Republican type thinking in the Congress. The Republicans have had to make a number of accommodations to him in his approach, but the outlook is still uncertain as to how much support he has in Congress and his relationship with Congress. And this is something where I think we have to consider this and use is Mr. Trump's personality, his leadership style. This is just the antithesis of Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. They want, regular, predictable types of things. And one thing that came up in my discussions with some staffers is the way he's treated Jeff Sessions. Donald Trump didn't have any expertise in foreign affairs when he was in the campaign. Sessions supported him. And Sessions' office was very important in managing his foreign and defense affairs, helping him in this early part of the campaign. He really went out of his way. And so the upshot here is that he is you'd think you'd be loyal to people like that. You'd be friendly. And of course, the way he treated Mr. Sessions in various ways has it diminished his. This is very important in Congress. You build personal relationships. You can trust people. You say, I can count on them. I know they oppose me, but I can count on them to do this and that. And Donald Trump just blew that away, and it makes it difficult. It underlines a basic problem he has, is that he's alienated himself from the traditional Republican elite in foreign affairs. They don't want to serve with him. They don't want to be part of this. And so, but the other things I'm watching, will the budget for defense be increased? And how the Congress and the administration work on this, I think, is very significant. Obviously, this is a big element in the national security strategy of the NSC and in the national defense strategy of the Pentagon. Both of them have this component. So let's see how it goes. But then a priority of issues of possible future zigzags, if we have a North Korean crisis, or if there's a decline in tension with China on this issue because of other priorities intervening, if the investigation of Mr. Trump in this campaign has different disclosures. There are just all sorts of elements that make this distractions that could come that would make it very difficult would impede an effective implementation of a strategy. And staff appointments. We still have a lot of staff appointments that haven't been done. And then China's response. How will China respond? Interestingly, China has been very cautious with Donald Trump. They've treated him a lot better than they treated Barack Obama. So you have to ask yourself, why is that happening? If Trump is so screwed up, why is it happening? Now, I'm a Democrat. I never vote Republican, but apologies to the Republicans. But the bottom line here, this is pretty interesting, because it shows the United States is somewhat. I'm not sure. We need to ask ourselves this. So let me stop there. My point is that I see grudging accommodation. I see convergence. I see the elements of a strategy emerging, and it's still an uncertain environment. But there's half a loaf to talk about at this point. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, questions?
From time to time, observations are made that China's actions are inconsistent with World Trade Organization policies. Would that issue fit within the scope of your paper?
Yes, that's very much an issue, sir. Yeah, this is China's unfair economic policies. It's a big issue, and you find the Special Trade Representative Office is led by a person who really feels strongly about that. The Commerce Department, pretty strongly about that. Whereas the Economic Council Director, not so strongly. He's much more, he's Goldman Sachs. He doesn't, and where Mr. Tillerson comes down, I'm not sure where he would come down on this issue. So it's a real, this clash. Oh, maybe I shouldn't be responding. I'm sorry.
Maybe short.
Never mind. I'll wait. Well, it's a great question, and sorry, but I didn't mean to go on. Sorry.
Sure. And Josh.
As usual, having served in the Congress for a few years as a staffer, I always enjoy this kind of analysis of congressional role in foreign affairs. So it was really nice to read it. But noting that I went over last time, I'll get right to the point. First. It seems that, from my optic, that there is this group of people at DOD, the NSC, and State Department policy planning who are coming to some kind of one mind about their perception of China. I don't want to oversell that case, but it might be something to look at in terms of whether if there are connections between those individuals and what's going on in the Congress. Right? Are people in these places meeting with certain people regularly on the Hill and is a consensus being arrived at vis-a-vis China. And then just a couple of things. I didn't notice Marco Rubio mentioned the U.S.-China Commission, USCC, the Executive Commission. It might, if you don't think they're important, you might just go ahead and say that they're not that important.
It's part of it. I know it's
But I think that these are,
it's an element of the pension.
I mean, having, I was talking to actually my former intern who's now the executive director of the U.S.-China Commission. It's amazing how these things happen. The point is, be nice to everyone. So I was nice to her, thankfully. But she was telling me that their perception is the commission has moved from a fringe to the middle of the debate, right? And is now, the room I testified in at the end of the day was packed. When I worked there, it really wouldn't have been. Right? So this suggests a kind of more attention to these kind of congressional bodies, and to the extent you can work them in to this, I think that's going to help. Also, we at the University of Texas have felt the brunt of Ted Cruz recently.
Right.
His name might appear somewhere in terms of naming avenues in front of the Chinese embassy after dissidents and not dissidents, but people who oppose the regime.
Yeah.
So there are these kind of individuals, and Rubio and Cruz might be the most two prominent. Chris Smith as well. People who have making China policy to some degree a cause, and to the extent that you can talk about their evolution on these issues and whether they're linking up with these other folks in other elements of the U.S. government as these chairs are being filled, do we see that coalescing, leading to some kind of a China policy?
Great, thank you. Randy?
I have a question that falls between Bob's and Eric's papers. I think that half of it's domestic and half of it's security. The domestic half is about Congress and military appropriations, congressional support for military expenditures and directions. It seems to me that we often talk about the gun lobby as an important influence in Congress, but there's the big gun lobby. Is also influence, and it's interesting that Congress often appropriates money that the Pentagon doesn't ask for. So as China becomes, with Russia, but definitely outranking Russia, the primary justification of high-tech, high-expense military appropriations, what role does Congress have in pushing that? And then I'll ask Eric, of course, about the strategic wisdom of that type of development.
All right, that gentleman over there.
Yes, Mr. Sutter, I think this was an excellent assessment of sort of the current situation. My question really from a policy perspective is this process similar to other administrations coming in? If so, yes. If not, how is it different? Are there lessons learned both from the congressional side and the administration side as to how to make this process work better or worse? What are some of the policy prescription judgments or assessments you can make as we're based on this assessment?
Thank you. Question in the back.
So one question is, I think this is an able summary of the kind of current state of debate, but I'd like to see a little bit more theoretical discussion of the domestic constraints that the Congress or civil society can actually impose on foreign policy, because it seems to it imbues a sense that it is a serious constraint, but it seems to me that the executive branch really has driven most of the policy over the years, so it's a little unclear if what Congress thinks about this issue is actually all that significant. And with respect to the executive branch, Tom Wright in the Atlantic, the Brookings Institution has a piece out today which basically says the Trump administration has two foreign policies. One that's in the national security strategy that says, rise of peer competitor, we need to prepare, we have geostrategic rivalry. And the actual policy of the Trump administration, at least himself, is doing none of those things to prepare for the strategic rivalry posed by China. And so that he doesn't actually believe in the strategy that's been written for him by Mattis and others. And so I think it's interesting thing to grapple with, that there's heterogeneity in views. There's kind of Trump-centric phenomenon, but it's a little unclear who. I think the executive branch is driving the bus, but I'm not sure if Trump is driving the bus.
Thomas Wright did this just recently?
Tom Wright did that today, yeah.
And this is from Brookings, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's important. Thank you.
Eric.
These were both terrific papers. I just wanted to ask whether it might be useful to draw out, whether, assuming you agree, but to draw out the tension in our objectives in Asia. And to a great extent, this was a surprise that was thrown at Trump, so it's not his fault. But Korea has become a vastly more important, vastly more pressing problem, and excuse my inflated rhetoric, but with sort of epical consequences. So, I mean, you made the case that there's greater coherence now in Trump's Asia policy and national security strategy statement and all these other things that show some thought about how to create a China policy to achieve a wider set of objectives with regard to China. But there's a huge tension here. I mean, do you want to give priority to addressing the Korea issue, in which case all of your other objectives with regard to China, other than getting China to put pressure on North Korea, go by the wayside, or do you want to pursue this larger objective vis-a-vis China? And so that's a big problem, and I don't know how you create a coherent policy without addressing that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, question here.
So again, I really enjoy and learned a great deal from the congressional and administrative interactions. I just wonder whether you can incorporate the economic multilateralism versus economic nationalism that separates Obama from Trump, and from the perceptions on the China side. Because the question that you posed a while ago is why China likes Trump better than Obama, and one important element of it is Obama's multilateral, globalist, condescending, top-down way to China, and that has pissed off many Chinese, and then so Trump, despite all this stuff, by his America first and nationalism, it's the business for business pragmatism that kind of strikes a chord with the Chinese perception. So whether you can incorporate in this type of economic ideology, and then how that is perceived between the two countries. Nationalism has a lot more sympathy in China than the type of globalist value, in particular liberal, democratic globalist value.
Thank you. Jessica?
One suggestion I might have for the paper is to talk about how these different signals coming out of Congress are perceived in the region. So when you mentioned that McCain and others go around trying to reassure allies at the beginning of the Trump administration, how credible were these reassurances, or and what are the variety of perceptions regarding the extent to which Congress and what it does matters? Because there may be a so-called objective reality, but then how it is seen abroad, I think, is, especially in China, is a particularly important question for how this dynamic affects the relationship.
All right. Since I'm the moderator, I'm going to actually ask the questions in the middle, because my question is actually very similar to what Jessica just asked. Because Trump is such a different leader compared to the previous presidents. So you think about the two drivers, you think about the Congress as a driver or breaker, but think about there's another drivers, like Trump seems to be a populist guy, so public opinion matters to him, but it's not public opinion of the overall Americans. It's public opinion to his base voter, at least the diehard Republicans that have some sort of share some view with them. And then another thing is, I read from the news is also like he's a very transactional, and then he's conducting a lot of meeting with individual in his resort in Florida. So that give access to many other, whether you can say lobbying group or other kind of individuals. So I guess it's with this in mind, like going forward, what do you think the influence of a Congress on Trump's China policy vis-a-vis public opinions of his really base voter, and other people that business or other lobbying group have much easier access to him now. So how does shape his view on China? Because so New Yorker just have this article came out a couple of weeks ago about Kirshner's, was the point guy for the China policy, although his role has diminished since. So just there's some other factor channel that has been introduced now that was not there before. So that I think that would be, so no one's I guess at least for me, I don't know who's calling the shot right now for the U.S. China policy. So that I think that worth considering in terms of the alternative channel that was not there in the previous administrations. All right, I'll need to go back to the, I'll go to the Kathy and then to Sam. Yeah.
Yes, so my question is a little bit similar to Xiaobo's, I think. So when I read the overview of the role of Congress in U.S. policy towards China over the past decades, and so my sense is that most of the time Congress is playing like a more indirect role, like playing behind, but sometimes the Congress did jump in, such as what Congress did for the Taiwan's Reaction Act. So my question is, maybe you can talk a little bit more from theoretical point, like what you think about why that makes the difference about the role of Congress, like why sometimes Congress play more indirect role most of the time, but why sometimes Congress decided to jump in. And based on that, and maybe towards the end, you can also talk a little bit about, given your thoughts about Trump's current policy towards China or lack of policy towards China, do you think, are we going to see more active role of Congress in U.S. policy towards China, or like the Congress still going to stay behind?
Thank you.
Okay, before I ask my question, I try answer one question Bob raised, why China like Trump better than Obama, because Trump is making China great again. In fact, that's what they told me. I was really impressed. I asked them, why you like Trump? You treat Trump much better than Obama. They said Trump is helping them to destroy America. So they want to support Trump. That's the, I don't joke, or the reality. The question here, you mentioned that the Congress, the foreign policy, the president has the upper hand normally is. So how the Congress from that type of weaker foreign policy position is important for us to understand the making of China policy, or foreign policy overall. And also another related question here is that you talked about the staffers were shocked when they discovered Trump's priority on the anti-free trade front. But how do you characterize the congressional views normally on the China policy? My impression is that they are normally or historically have been more conservative than the executive branch, even on the free trade or protectionist position. So how do you characterize this and reconcile those type of long-term trend of congressional views of China, congressional positions over China in the relationship with the executive branch or with the president? Not only the Trump here, from historical perspective.
Okay. This question over there.
I think you've done a great job of analyzing the change in U.S. foreign policy towards China. My question, has anybody done an analysis from the Chinese side of the equation as to how they are reacting to the change, and do they wait it out for 4 years and see if we're going back to the Obama and previous engagement policy, or are they going to make changes as to the present policy? It appears that, from my limited knowledge, that they are trying to take advantage of the change of policy by engaging more in that part of the world. And so I'd like to know if anybody has analyzed that from their standpoint.
Great, thank you. Actually, the next panel will be looking at that aspect of the policy. Yes, questions?
Since you mentioned personal relationships, Elaine Chao, Secretary of Commerce, Mitch McConnell's wife, what is her role, if any, in China policy?
Any other questions? All right. Actually, I have another question for you. You want to respond?
Should I respond, say something?
Sure, you have time, actually. Yeah, you have time. Why don't you respond to
There's a lot raised here, and a lot I can't do. And I view the paper is designed, in my view, to show Congress as a reflection of the domestic constraints on U.S.-China relations. Congress reflects that. How powerful Congress is in China policy, I don't think it's all that powerful. Congress has been pretty passive in foreign policy for 20 years now, and so it's to say that they're really influential and so forth. I don't think I'd say that. What I say, what's important is what's reflected there, because what's reflected in the Congress reflects a broader interest, various interests in the United States that the U.S. policy would have to take into account. So I think that's why it's important, more important than actually what it's prepared to do. Is it prepared to stand up to Mr. Trump on foreign policy? I don't think so. I just don't see that. I haven't seen that happen since, what was it, Tom DeLay was the director of the House. It just didn't happen in the last two decades. Very little. So that's one element. And then, getting into the intricacies of the administration and how these things are done is very tricky. I don't have this kind of, what Josh was talking about, this scenario of this group in the NSC and DOD and State Department doing this kind of thing. The national security strategy has to be an interagency body, interagency operation. And so the fact that state signed off on that is remarkable, it seemed to me. It's just absolutely remarkable. That isn't where they are. And yet somebody at state signed off on it, so it's I assume. So that's something to keep in mind. Most of these comments get into just how powerful is Congress, and so I'll have to point that out, and I don't think it's that powerful. It was more powerful in the 70s and the 80s in dealing with China policy, and I can give you concrete examples of that, and the things we're seeing today are reflections of questioning and resistance or unhappiness in the United States about various aspects of U.S. policy toward China. Elaine Chao's role, I just don't know what her role is. I don't think it's all that important, but she's at Labor, right? Is that she runs the Labor Department?
She is Congress now.
No, transportation.
No, Ross is Commerce. Ross is
Transportation.
Transportation.
Yeah.
Transportation. Right. Transportation. Okay, that's. And then the other dimension is just be ready for Mr. Trump changes. He values unpredictability. I mean, this is a very different type of president, and so we just have a president who says, "I'm in a better position," and ladies and gentlemen, he values tension. He likes tension. We haven't had a president like this in my whole life. He values tension. And I judge that you're not going to, if you're his staffer and you go to him, sir, he says, "Sir, we shouldn't have all this tension, it's bad for us." He said, he'd turn around and say, "Look, buddy," he says, "I got elected president because I created and used tension in a way that made my opponents on the back foot, and I won against enormous odds." He didn't win, so he created a lot of tension. He exploited, he wrote it. Lower the tension. So he's a guy that loves tension. I worked with a senator who was like this, but there are these people that do that, and I think we need to keep that in mind because it'll have a big impact on how this all plays out. And when people have a nice and tidy type of arrangement, he just come in and he'll upset it.
Great. Thank you.
Just one point on
Okay,
this.
yeah.
Bob, you just said something that was really interesting, that Congress was more powerful in the 70s and 80s on China policy, but has since kind of...
In foreign affairs in general, this is a broader trend.
I was thinking one thing this paper could use generally is a larger framing question. And maybe that's part, I don't know that that's it specifically, but maybe that's part of it, saying, well, in the past we saw the TRA, we saw other things, Congress was active, and maybe a larger framing question can be, will we see a resurgent active Congress on China or not? And you can answer that however you might. I think that there are, as I said before, people like Cruz and Rubio, U.S.-China Commission, who would like to produce a more active congressional role in this. And one question you would be perfectly placed to answer is, will that be successful, or will that, falter on the rocks of reality?
A little data point. Yeah. Mr. Rubio and Mr. Leahy have gotten together to look at Chinese United Front activities in the United States.
Yeah.
Now, Patrick Leahy is a liberal from Vermont, and he's very knowledgeable. He's been on the Foreign Operations Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee for like 30 years. He knows the State Department backwards and forwards. And the fact that he would sign on with Rubio on this kind of thing is just this is Walter Russell Mead talks about the right and the left coming together on China policy. They did this after Tiananmen. You'd have Jesse Helms and Wellstone from Minnesota, co-sponsoring things. Well, it's happening. It's starting to happen on China. How far? I don't know how far to take it, but it's part of what's happening right now.
Well, with congressional Republicans seeming to be unhappy with a look at Russian intervention, right? They seem to be unhappy, pushing back at certain folks who are identifying that issue. It seems, from my optic, just being in Washington, that there is nobody who's going to criticize you for attacking the Chinese on influence campaigns. So it's just fertile ground. If you want to work on that issue, there's nobody who's going to say no congressional Republican is going to stop you. So it's almost as if the Russians interfered and the Chinese are getting the worst of it because there's nobody to defend them or support them. I don't know if you would agree with that, but it seems that...
Nobody stands up and supports the Russians either, though.
But
all right, let's save some time for Eric, because I want to make sure that you have enough time to get feedback. So please go ahead to have your presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I apologize for having the computer open, but that's the way I'm doing business today. So our paper looked at the domestic influences. Oh, well, first of all, let me say I'm probably in the wrong panel. So essentially the paper was about domestic influences on China's nuclear policy. We've got a little section that's essentially a lit review on the domestic influences on U.S. nuclear policy. But this is a trilateral effort here. I wrote this with Jacob Heim, who's really by far and away one of the smartest young analysts at RAND. Just a terrific guy. Some of his best writing is buried in security reviews at the moment, but in any case, he's an up-and-comer. And Chris Toomey, this goes back to Josh's point about being nice to everybody. He's an old drinking buddy. Now he runs the Track 1.5 dialogues with China on strategic nuclear issues, which is, I think there's been one official dialogue with the Chinese on this, and everything else has been this Track 1.5, which happens twice a year, and it's the senior-most dialogue, and very useful. It gets a shout-out in the current nuclear posture review, which is floating around the internet at this point in unofficial versions. So anyways, those are my co-authors. If there are any mistakes in here and problems, it's all their fault. Don't look at me. Okay, so again, we focused on China. Now, to be clear, that's not because we think the domestic influences are greater in the case of China. In fact, if anything, I would say the opposite is true. But the domestic influences have been pretty well covered on the U.S. side over the years. In fact, some of the best literature on the domestic influences on foreign policy is on nuclear questions. So we focused on the China side, and that's really what I'll talk about today. We talked a little bit about context in the paper. obviously we've already discussed to an extent the growing security competition between the two countries, discussion of the Thucydides trap and the possibility of, great power war, again, in the context of power transitions, etc. China's power obviously rising quite fast. As far as the defense budget is concerned, in inflation-adjusted terms, it's 650-odd% growth since 1996, so really quite dramatic. On the conventional side, China's pursued a very broad-based and effective program of military modernization that's really diminished U.S. dominance in the region very substantially and created quite a bit of concern here. And then, of course, there are all the flashpoints we've talked about with South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan. So, the nuclear piece of this fits into that context. Now, as far as China's historic nuclear policy is concerned, China has, since it first tested in 1964, really punched below its weight. It's maintained a very small nuclear force, and a force that's commensurate with its nuclear policy. So since 1964, it's maintained a no first use policy, which means it will not use nuclear weapons unless nuclear weapons are used against it. It's fairly clear in its definition of that policy. We could get into debate about that definition, but in any case, China's been fairly consistent on this point since 1964. As far as their force building is concerned, they use a standard that they call lean and effective. Lean means small, effective means it can survive a nuclear attack to retaliate. A lot of people label this a minimum deterrent, but it's actually sub-minimum deterrent. And minimum deterrent, in the French or English, British context from the Cold War means there's a threshold of destruction they have to wreak upon an enemy after their attack. China doesn't maintain that kind of minimum threshold. Basically, it's what I would call really an existential deterrent. We might have a nuke or two that survive, and that's going to be really bad for you because nukes are, something you don't want to mess with. So that's been their policy to date. And again, unlike the Soviet Union, which also had a no first use policy, but, never even pretended to abide by it, China's force structure has really matched that. So again, a very small number of nuclear weapons. In 1996, probably 7 warheads that could reach the United States. As late as 2006, 20 warheads that could reach the United States. So a very, very small force of strategic nuclear weapons. Obviously a somewhat larger force of intermediate range weapons that could range large parts of the Soviet Union and obviously East Asia. The other piece of this is that those systems were very inaccurate. So they could hit a city, but they were not useful for counterforce. You couldn't use these for nuclear warfighting. And there was no launch on warning capability. So they're slow to load, they're liquid fueled, and there was no early warning system. So never any question of early warning. And this is a policy that China very consciously pursued, and it served their interests. Among the other things that this does is it's stabilizing because it does not create first use incentives. Your whole policy is you retaliate. At the same time, because you can't strike first, there's no incentive for your opponent to strike you first for fear that you'll get off the first shot. So, again, very much a conscious part of Chinese policy. So, what we did in the paper, I'm sorry, I'm probably halfway through my time already. But
you have 5 minutes.
Okay, so what we wanted to do, we set up a structure. It's not the only structure we could have used. There are other elements we could have looked at, but essentially we sort of took a bastardized version of Graham Allison's 3 models of decision making. So we looked at the rational actor model, the bureaucratic politics, a cut at this, which is just simply what does the nuclear constituency look like within the PLA and how much power and influence does it have over time. And then probably the most interesting piece of this, which is bureaucratic process and how bureaucratic processes and thinking and institutional relationships affect the shape of the force. And all these things are changing quite rapidly. So I'll walk through some of this. Sorry, before I do, I will say China's nuclear forces are themselves changing. So the other piece of this context, I talked about the history and the small force and the policy, but in the last 10 years, China has really accelerated nuclear force building. It's also modernized its nuclear forces. They were very late doing this, but they've added mobile missiles, the DF-31s, the 31As, the 41s. All these can hit the United States. They now have a credible submarine-based nuclear deterrent for the first time. So they have 4 Jin-class submarines, each of which has 12 tubes, and more modern submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And then they have also just most recently MIRVed their missiles, so put multiple warheads on their DF-5s, and they're probably going to do that with their DF-41s. So they went from having 20 warheads that could strike the United States in 2006 to probably something on the order of 110 or 20 today. And if they MIRV more missiles, they could have a lot, they could be up to 200 fairly shortly. Okay, so that's some of the context about the changes that are taking place, and now the domestic drivers. Rational actor model, this was kind of the hardest to do and would probably be the most controversial in this room. But our assessment is, first of all, again, on a comparative basis, there are a lot of things about the Chinese system that make it amenable to a view of the rational actor model, the rational decision making that might not apply to other countries. So it's a very centralized military system with the political leaders in charge. There's a central military commission. There's one military force, and it's directed by the CMC. If you look at, for example, Indian strategic decision making, there are 3 services. There's nothing that unites them. Each service has a different strategy, and there's essentially no connection between them. So that's one aspect, is that I think, in a lot of ways, the Chinese system itself is amenable to this rational actor model. But the other question is, how has it changed over time? And our assessment was that the Chinese political and policymaking system as a whole has been bureaucratized and routinized over time. Again, so a relative shift towards a system that does allow more bureaucratic influences. Now, we could debate some of this, but if you go back to Mao's day, clearly a fused leadership in which political leaders all had quite a bit of military experience. Josh is right that military policy was in a lot of ways a blood sport. But on the other hand, there's no evidence that sort of Mao's belief in people's war, while it served his instrumental purposes, wasn't also his view of military rationality. So, he didn't keep glossy pictures of tanks and fighter aircraft under his pillow at night. He wasn't a secret fan of high-tech warfare. So that was the system under Mao, and obviously that's changed quite a bit since Jiang Zemin's day and Deng Xiaoping's day, first with the regularization of Chinese policymaking. The military itself has become much more bureaucratic and regularized. The services now behave like services should. In other words, they pursue more resources and they promote their own agendas. That just simply wasn't true previously. So you would find a guy, the deputy commander of the Nanjing military region, or a lifetime army officer advocating a naval, maritime strategy. But starting in the 1980s, you really see institutionalization of the services. Liu Huaqing was probably the first of these. So again, we can debate this, but in any case, our assessment is you do have more scope now for bureaucratic actors to exercise influence in military policymaking. On the nuclear side, nuclear policy was and continues to be made largely in this National Defense Industrial Special Commission, which really exercised a very tight grip on nuclear policy making in Mao's day. And there's evidence that this group, this fused civil military leadership, did get involved in the nitty-gritties of not just how many nukes to produce, but also what kind. So we have evidence that they vetoed the deployment of certain capabilities that they had developed. They had the capability to deploy these things, and they didn't. So that's true both in the neutron bomb. They went ahead, they developed a neutron bomb and never deployed it. It's true in the case of MIRVs. The CIA assessed that China could have deployed MIRVs as early as the 1970s. They didn't do it until 2015. And you know, I think it's also true in a couple of other areas. So there's evidence of real restraint going back in time. Okay, sorry. So now fast forward to today, we'll talk a little bit about bureaucratic politics. One thing that's fairly clear is nuclear constituencies have steadily gained ground, and they can now be expected to be more capable advocates for the nuclear mission itself. I will say here, we get into a little bit of the endogeneity problem. You know, what's the driver here? Is it international or is it bureaucratic? If the leadership thinks the nuclear mission is more important and growing, therefore we will see a larger constituency for it. But there are also other drivers. So starting in 2004, the CMC gained a type of institutionalized membership that hadn't been true before, so the services gained representation. The Air Force and the Navy and the 2nd Artillery, the nuclear force or the missile force, gained sort of permanent institutional representation on the CMC. CMC was reorganized during the last party Congress, but all three of the services were again represented, this time in functional roles, not representing the services themselves. But in any case, they've kept this representation of the technical services within the CMC. In 2015, the rocket force, the 2nd Artillery Force, the name was changed to the Rocket Force, and it was elevated from a branch, a military branch, to a military service. In other words, its rank was elevated to be equal to that of the Air Force and the Navy. We looked at promotion timelines for commanders of the Rocket Force, and whereas they used to lag very substantially behind the other technical services even, today they don't. They're about dead even with the other technical services. And of course there are now more of them. So the Rocket Force now represents a much more significant constituency, or potentially a lobbying force for the nuclear mission. At the same time, now you have these 4 GINs in the Navy. Now you have a nuclear constituency within the Navy. And the PLA Air Force has also gotten into the game, despite the fact that their first tests in '64 were nuclear weapons dropped from bombers. They have not maintained a nuclear bomber force. But most recently, the PLA Air Force has argued that it should be considered a strategic air force, and they're developing a new bomber that will almost certainly be dual capable, the H-20, which is a flying wing, looks a lot like the B-2, probably built on B-2 plans, but in any case, now we're going to have sort of constituencies within all 3 of the services, at least 2 already. And then finally, the organizational process model, and again, I think this is really the most interesting. The 2nd Artillery had been exclusively a nuclear force. Starting in the mid-1990s, it gained a conventional mission. So it gained the mission of supporting conventional strikes with conventionally armed ballistic missiles. Today, roughly half of the brigades are conventionally armed, and those systems differ from systems on the nuclear side in terms of the inventory, the quality, and the posture. There's no firewall between the conventional side of the house and the nuclear side of the house, and it stands to reason that a lot of the capabilities that are developed for the conventional side will be applied to the nuclear side. So for conventional missiles, you need far greater accuracy because you're not aiming at the rough vicinity of a city. You actually have to hit a base or an airstrip. So China's added a number of different guidance systems to its conventional missiles. And unless you wanted to spend more money to make a less accurate missile, you would naturally apply those guidance systems to the nuclear force. And in fact, you now have the very first system that was designed as a dual-use system. So the DF-21 was designed to be conventional, and then they applied it to the nuclear side. But the DF-26 was designed to be both, and the DoD assesses that gives China its first nuclear precision strike capability against theater targets. So again, now that they have accurate nuclear missiles, this does give them, at least in theory, a potential nuclear counterforce capability. There are other capabilities that go that have that they've grown in conjunction with the conventional side of the house. Dynamic retargeting. So they have a conventionally armed missile that's designed to attack naval ships at sea. So this can receive updates in flight. The ability to redirect these things quickly and to be used in conjunction in real time with the ISR, with the surveillance assets overhead. So again, if you apply these capabilities to the nuclear side, that gives you a nuclear warfighting capability. And then finally, the ability to launch salvos and operate under battlefield conditions. Now, in theory, this is something you want your nuclear force to do, and they had talked about it in that context. But it's really with the introduction of the conventional brigades that you see them out in the field, exercising hard under conditions in which they're getting attacked by Blue Force bombers. So, all of these things affect the nature of what we're going to see as far as the Chinese nuclear force being deployed today. And yet they are, at least to an extent, in tension with China's historic nuclear policy. So that's where we are.
Great. Thank you. All right, any questions? Yes.
To what extent are they developing anti-ballistic missiles?
Okay. Yes.
So Eric, I want to learn more than the paper that I read, which is, I was wondering, in Johnston talks about the socialization that changes China's nuclear policy. And here, when you look at the domestic politics, in particular, we talk about U.S.-China relationship in this nuclear context. What's new things you want to socialize China into, and whether the domestic institutions or bureaucracies, individuals, what kind of track 2 or semi-institutional things going on here. It's not, I probably won't be able to cover in the paper, but that's something that I find it really interesting when you talk about the domestic politics, that is how external interaction might shape their thinkings and the policy.
Thank you. Randy?
I'd like to raise a hypothetical that I hope remains hypothetical. But that would be, what do you think the effect of a U.S. strike against North Korea using tactical nuclear weapons would be on Chinese nuclear policy and further development? And the reason I hope it remains hypothetical is, the reason why I think it's worth considering is the derailment of Victor Cha's nomination for ambassador to South Korea, and the statement 2 days ago by President Trump that events can reunify the country in context of the 2018 election.
Thank you. Yes.
Two small points. One similar to kind of the feedback for other panelists. The push-pull tension between how China is thinking about the nuclear posture review in the U.S. I think that could actually be a useful thing to include when or if, depending on the timeline of the paper, obviously, and the review. And then second of all, I think if you're going to talk about the civ-mil dynamics historically, it would also be good to stretch that to the present and look at how under Xi Jinping they're trying to integrate, for instance, the private sector or state-owned enterprises, and how that really supports the PLA and the nuclear posture and capabilities today.
Thank you. Another question on that.
I find the elevation of the rank and stature of the 2nd Artillery really interesting. So I really want to learn more about the specific implications of this. For example, you made the argument on page 16 that the nuclear constituency has gained ground within other services. You then talk about their gaining ground in the Navy force. So I'm wondering, so does this mean that, this confirms our belief that China is trying to build a greater naval force? And what does this say about the potential U.S.-China confrontations in the Western Pacific? So that would be interesting.
Josh.
Yeah, it's funny, I read this paper first, right? So now I'm kind of like trying to interpret my own scribble from a week ago. Happens a lot. Okay, so a couple of points here, and you may have actually gone into them more, but I've got from someone to mention them. One is, certainly we've seen a political consolidation in the military. We've seen a lot of purges of the highest levels of the military. What does that mean for this, right? You lose, Xi Zhao, all these guys are gone. A whole new group in there. They're Xi's guys. And what's their view on all of this, right? So again, going into Lauren's point a minute ago, the politics, as we know, the PLA is a political actor in the Chinese system. And so you've got this major changing of the guard. But you also have a changing of the entire system, right? Because Xi Jinping reoriented all the military regions, right? Didn't he? You know better than I all the details of that reorientation, but I'm not sure, did you get into here what that reorientation means for this nuclear question? Does that change the lines about who's under what in command? Because it was a pretty significant reorganization. My understanding, you'd know better, again, as a mill guy, but the biggest since the founding of the country. And so what does that huge reorganization of the military and gutting of the upper echelon mean for this nuclear strategy? And that goes to a larger question, which is, as we read in Lauren's paper and other papers, we know Xi Jinping is a more assertive leader. From what you're saying, it seems that assertiveness extends to the nuclear capacity as well, right? And so understanding a little bit about how he perceives the role of the nuclear capacity in this new assertive China dream, make China great again kind of approach, right? What's the role of the nuclear weapon? Because certainly in America, Donald Trump has talked about that almost in, again, like you said before, along with the conventional, right? He hasn't really drawn the distinction. And so I don't know if there's any comparisons worth making, it probably not, but the politics, right, as a political scientist, putting that politics in.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
To what extent does China's outreach to having bases in Djibouti, Pakistan, South China Sea add any real increased military capability to their forces, for example, in the deployment of the anti-ship missiles?
Other questions? All right, I'm going to throw myself in for one question. I think it's very interesting you bring up the point about bureaucracy and bureaucracy's role in shaping the nuclear policy. I think also fascinating you have this comparison about the United States and China. But I find the United States part is a little bit thin compared to the China part. You have a lot of discussion about the organizations, bureaucracy the changes, and then the domestic drivers of those. But for the U.S. side, it's I guess 2 pages or less. And the reason I think is matter to probably put more worth in the U.S. side in part because the change of administration where there's an argument being made about Trump does not have a really clear idea on this kind of issues, so that gives room for bureaucratic lobbying. From a political science perspective, every bureaucracy have incentive to try to emphasize the importance of the issues the bureaucracy is dealing with and try to get more resources, right? So every bureaucracy ministry have that incentive. So given Trump does not have, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, that have not clear idea or kind of a principle that how to deal with this kind of that give room for bureaucracy to lobby, not just bureaucracy dealing with nuclear weapon, but all the other bureaucracy as well. So I guess it would be interesting to have some discussion on potential bureaucratic impact on U.S. Nuclear policy, not only towards China but towards overall, and how much you think that the agency is going to have a bigger impact, given Trump also like to increase spending on military, even like someone said, the Pentagon has not asked for it. So how that will have impact the balance, because once the United States, generate more spending on this, China is going to react, right? Potentially. That now you're spending more on this, are you trying to create more threats? So how to change the dynamic, how each side view each other's nuclear capacity and the intentions.
Good.
And then I think we have about 7 minutes. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, please.
Just one. I mean, I know this is primarily about U.S.-China and things of that sort, but when you look at Chinese nuclear policy, they really are tied in a knot between how they look at the Russians, how they look at the Indians, and how they look at the United States, and they're very different nuclear forces and nuclear structures that they need to that. And I don't know if there's a space to play a little bit of how that plays into the way in which that's dynamic in shaping their internal policy and the way in which they shape their force structure might come to light.
Right, good.
All right, do you want to respond?
Sure. These are all great points, and some of them are things that we already wanted to incorporate. Maybe I'll start towards the back and move up. But U.S. parts being thin, absolutely. That was kind of a late ad, actually, and I think it needs to be sharpened and strengthened quite a bit. Among other things, U.S. is a democracy. Democracies are great, but as far as policy making, we can confuse people. So in the track 1.5s, we spent a lot of time talking to the Chinese about Obama's nuclear posture review and how we've incorporated their concerns and this, that, and the other thing. And their response is, well, yes, and next year you're going to have a new nuclear policy because your president's going to change. And it's very hard to argue with that. And in fact, we have a new president and we have a new nuclear posture review. The nuclear component of that will be doubled as a % of the defense budget, and of course the defense budget itself is going up. So yeah, and this feeds very directly into Chinese concerns. So the main driver here, although India and other countries are becoming a more significant issue for the Chinese, the main driver is obviously the United States. And the Chinese fear that the combination of a very large, capable U.S. nuclear force combined with a defense capability can strip them of their ability to retaliate. So we may think our defenses are not effective and not useful, which is probably a good objective assessment, but from a Chinese perspective, they have to take them seriously. And if you've got 44 interceptors, and if you think that maybe only a handful of your missiles are going to survive, if you think the U.S. has a shoot, look, shoot capability, this can cause you to lose sleep if you're a Chinese planner. So in any case, yes, definitely need to sharpen the U.S. side and also talk about the dynamic between the two countries. Consolidation of power and some of these issues with reform of the PLA, absolutely, we should probably talk a little bit more about this. As far as some of the other reforms that took place, at the same time that the rocket force was elevated in stature, a strategic support force was created, and this actually settled the long-running sort of tussle between the 2nd Artillery, the missile people, and the PLA Air Force, both of whom wanted to control satellites and the space mission. The PLA Air Force wanted it within the Air Force. The ultimate outcome is that the rocket force got exactly what it wanted, which is an independent force, the strategic support force, which now controls the space mission, and their people own it, basically. I mean, it's former strategic rocket force people who command it. And that's got implications for how space and satellites are conceived of. I can get into some of that. So yeah, we probably want to talk more about some of these organizational issues and Xi's impact on outcomes. The lobby, the other services, probably should have spent a little bit more time talking about that. So not only are there are there constituencies in the other services that affect maybe the magnitude, the size, the relative importance of China's nuclear forces within the larger military context. And in fact, now you do see at conferences nuclear figures saying we should have a nuclear force that's commensurate with our size, not just an existential nuclear deterrent. So you actually see some of this. But maybe more importantly, as these other two services become involved, it will have implications for broader aspects of policy. So up to this point, the Chinese have not mated the delivery systems, in other words, the missiles with the nuclear warheads. They are kept at a central depot and separate. Again, that's part of the no first use policy. It sort of enhances the credibility of that no first use policy. They may be distributed down to the bases for exercises and these sorts of things, but essentially they're not mated. Now you have submarines. They go to sea as part of a deterrence mission, and to do so and be credible, you have to mate the missiles and the warheads. Is that going to change the rocket force's perspective on what their posture should look like? So that, you know, again, I think the Air Force and naval ownership of part of the nuclear mission will have implications again more broadly for policy and posture. Question about U.S. strike, I think I covered that, Brantley. And then, finally, this the first question, a great question on you know, how we might want to socialize China. So there's been some good academic work on epistemic communities and how over time, effectively our engagement with the Soviets socialized the Soviet strategic decision-making community to some of our concerns. And particularly the element of what does structural stability mean in a nuclear context. So regardless of the size of your force and who has an advantage, one over the other, you can engineer a nuclear structure to be relatively secure where neither side has an incentive to strike first, if you have single warheads on missiles and if they're highly secure, or you can have a very unstable situation, let's say, where all of your nuclear force is kept on bomber bases at zero alert, right? So the other side can wipe you out by going first. So regardless of the size of the force, there are issues about structural stability. And I think that's what we want to socialize. And, I've been involved in the track 1.5s for, I don't know, probably, 7 or 8 years and maybe 5 or 6 different meetings over that time. And it's been an interesting process, and I think the Chinese are now more willing to engage in that discussion, whereas at the outset they were much more interested in statements of U.S. intent and what the political relationship was, and I think now they're a little more willing to engage in a discussion of really how we ought to think about making our military forces more safe in a structural sense.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think we're running out of time. Sorry, Sam, I didn't give a chance for you to respond. Okay, great. I think we have a great panel. Have a lot of insightful discussions. I think they'll enhance our standing. By the look of your face, I think you desperately need some coffee and fresh air. So with the next session will start at 10:30.
Yeah, 10:30. 15-minute break.
15 minutes break. So let's give applause to the